You are about to embark on an epic journey, the 32 Beethoven Piano Sonatas, and they cover the entire range of his creative life, from his first sonata of 1795, when he was just 25, to his last sonata of 1822, just 5 years before he died. And traditionally, we divide his life and works into 3 periods: early, middle, and late. It's a very useful framework, which you can probably throw away once you know the sonatas really well. But we're going to use it tonight because we're going to give you a whirlwind snapshot tour of these sonatas. So let's begin. So it's 1792. Beethoven is 22, and he's about to embark on a journey, leaving his hometown of Bonn to Vienna to try to make it as a pianist and as a composer. But as far as his patrons in Bonn are concerned, he's gone to learn from the greatest living composer at that time, Joseph Haydn. And Beethoven's very good friend, Count Waldstein, writes in Beethoven's farewell autograph volume these prophetic words. He writes, "You're going to Vienna to receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn." The spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. So the question is, what did he get from the hands of Haydn? And what is the spirit of Mozart? So, Haydn first. Beethoven got 3 things from Haydn. 1, Haydn was the master of form. He is the composer's composer. His forms are intellectually virtuosic, and Beethoven wanted to outperform Haydn's form. 2, Haydn was the master of what we call the motivic technique. That is, you take a very small element from a theme, and then you repeat it, and you develop it, and you create these extraordinary, very complex organic structures from it. And Beethoven wanted to outmaneuver Haydn's motivic artistry. And 3, Haydn was the master of humor. Or more correctly, he was the master of what we would call ironic wit. You can imagine Haydn as the person with a dry, wry, all-knowing smile while he composes music, playing very self-consciously with the illusion of art. And Beethoven wanted to outwit Haydn's wit. So 3 things: form, motives, and wit. And if Beethoven had a signature song during his time studying with Haydn, it would be this: anything you can do, I can do better. So that's Haydn. What about Mozart? What is the spirit of Mozart? Well, when we think about Mozart, we always think of Mozart as the composer of grace and of lightness. And he is. But compared to Haydn, Mozart is a very dark composer. And Beethoven was attracted to the dark side of Mozart, what the theologian Karl Barth calls Mozart's shadow side, his minor mode works. So for Beethoven, Mozart's magic is the tragic. Now, if you put that side of Mozart together with those 3 elements of Haydn, what do you get? You get extreme piano music. We often call this music the classical music in the classical style, but it's actually just very controlled wildness. Beethoven's imagination was extraordinary. It was innovative. It was radical. So, it's 1792. And Beethoven gets onto his carriage and heads to Vienna. But his most important vehicle are, in fact, his piano sonatas. Why is that, Gilles?
Well, he was a master keyboard artist. And so, maybe we think of Beethoven, maybe you've seen certain statues that have him brooding, or you know about his ailment and maybe how he became alienated from society and isolated. Well, this wasn't the case when he's writing the early sonatas. He was a young man coming to Vienna, wanting to make a name for himself. He was business savvy. We know he tried to investigate possible family links with aristocracy. He wanted to meet the important people, the wealthy people, and play for the right people. And so his vehicle for disseminating his reputation was his virtuosity and imagination on the instrument, mostly actually through improvisation, but also through writing pieces that would then be picked up by publishers. And then, the point of these early sonatas is for gifted amateurs to then go out and think, oh, I've heard of this Beethoven, and here's a piece that he wrote, and I'm gonna put it down here and try to figure out how to play it. You know, and so those were the markets for his talent and his genius at that age. So and since he was such a great keyboard artist, Piano Sonatas become a natural vehicle for that. They also allow him to experiment. And you can sense that in the early sonatas. The piano is a laboratory for him. A lot of the early sonatas are large scale in 4 movements. That's something we might associate with symphonic music. So the ambition is there from the beginning.
Yes, and he writes almost half of his piano sonatas in his early period. In fact, 14 of them are written in the space of just 6 years. So this is a really important medium for him right now. Now, do you want to hear some music? Yeah, let's do that. So let's start from the very beginning. So the Opus 2 number 1, the first piano sonata in F minor, is a great place to start.
Very first one, so.
Okay, that's enough, thank you. Now.
But it is enough.
That's all, it's enough.
Yeah.
Remember Haydn's thing about, the motivic technique? That's all you need in this piece for the entire movement.
You have what's called a Mannheim rocket, and then you have this.
Oh, the Mannheim rocket. You need to explain that because it's not from JPL.
Well, it sounds like a rocket, doesn't it? I mean, it goes up.
Yeah, it's a really popular thing in Mannheim for an orchestra. It was very exciting at the time. So Beethoven's first sonata begins with this Mannheim rocket, but this is a rocket that will keep developing in the piano sonata. So we hear the first sentence, you will hear this rocket at the first little phrase, and then it'll become a much bigger phrase. And also, if you listen very carefully, you will hear that arpeggio and that little turn figure being developed. That's all he needs just for that first sentence. So this sonata is dedicated to Haydn. And I would say that this is his most Haydn-esque sonata, particularly this movement. It's lean, it's controlled, it's very athletic, and it has this motivic thing. It has the Mozart sort of dark mood because it's an F minor, but this is really Beethoven being Haydn. But then the next movement is a bit more Mozarty, right?
Yes. So this is typical of many Beethoven slow movements in his early period. We're in the world of opera. It's an adagio, generous with time, and you really can imagine yourself hearing maybe the Contessa giving forgiveness.
So you have the Haydn in the first movement, the Mozart in the second movement. But it's in the last movement that you get something that is distinctively Beethoven. It's not going to be Mozart or Haydn. And it goes like this. So what innovations are happening here?
Well, I mean, that sounds like Beethoven. So why does it sound like Beethoven? There's this energy in the left hand, and then there's the idea of the melody. What is the melody? I'm reminded of almost a dog barking or something, but the idea of violent contrast as well, from piano to forte, and again, this non-stop feeling of energy. And of course, it's an example, which we'll have many of today, of a storm movement.
Yeah. So this is a kind of storm where you can imagine there's a rider and he's being chased and he's moving very, very, very fast. And this is a huge sort of romantic kind of imagery that Beethoven's following up here. And these types of chase storm movements become more and more intense in Beethoven. So everything really is here in the first sonata. But then we want to give you a contrast. And this is the sonata number 4, where things begin to expand. So everything in the first sonata is very, very concise, very Haydn-esque in this way. But now he's going to do something that is huge.
Yeah, he expands the form. One of the things that'll be a theme today is that mastery of form, where I can abbreviate things without leaving anything out, but I can also expand things to massive dimensions. So this is that. This was a sonata he was very, very ambitious about, the Opus 7. He put a lot of effort into it. He gave it a nickname. Now, you may all say, well, what's so special about that? There are all these Moonlight, Pathétique. I've heard of all these nicknames. Those nicknames are all given to the sonatas by people other than Beethoven. This one had a nickname given by Beethoven. He called it the Grand Sonata. It didn't stick.
No.
Yeah. I don't know, it just doesn't have any kind of ring to it, I guess. But yeah,
it's
everything
grand for a reason.
Yeah, that's right. Well, actually it's the longest sonata other than the Hammerklavier.
Yeah, it's huge.
Happening as early as this, right? It's the fourth sonata that he writes. So here's how it goes.
So you can hear that first phrase, right? It's just undulating. He's just sort of sitting on an E-flat major triad, and he's just playing around with it, and it goes on and on and on and on. So it's very, very expansive. So it has this feel of a landscape to it. And because he's expanding things in this way, with this kind of landscape feel and very slow harmonic movements, it begins somehow to remind us of the music of Schubert, because Schubert is a composer of landscapes and with these long, long forms. So actually there are moments in this piece where things take a very Schubertian turn.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things also in our talk today, a theme that will appear that is remarkable is these moments that seem prophetic, where you're playing a piece of Beethoven's and you think, oh, that sounds like something somebody did 50, 60 years later. It happens a lot to different threads in the history of music. Of course, some of that is because these sonatas were so influential and people studied them, of course. But there's more than that that's going on. So in this sonata has a remarkable ending. For a work so big and grand, it ends with this incredible winding down of energy and relaxation. And there's a shift in tonality that it sounds really like Schubert. And I believe the sonata was written the year Schubert was born. So how is that possible? You know, so here's how the sonata ends.
So echoes of Schubert. Are you enjoying the music so far? Okay. Now I've got some bad news for you. The slow movement is not for Americans, because research has shown that Americans cannot stand silence for too long. If you watch a Hollywood movie, you know, more than 4 seconds of silence, apparently, Americans start to fret. It becomes very, very dangerous and scary for Americans. Whereas if you're in Asia, like me, if you come from Japan especially, 90 seconds of silence in a movie is totally fine. So the slow movement of this particular sonata is not really for you. It's kind of like Tai Chi. It's really, really slow with lots of silences that really test your patience. Do you want to hear this? Yeah. Okay.
He's not exaggerating. I mean, it's just...
Okay, and it goes on and on like this. It's a very long, slow movement. But what I want to play for you from this movement is one octave chord where you're not going to hear what Beethoven wants you to hear. And it goes like this.
So I play this note, and then I'm supposed to make it get louder to get to here. So I have to play the note, and he tells me crescendo on the note.
It's crazy, right? Why would Beethoven do that?
I guess he wants you as the pianist to feel, because this is our curse. When we play a note on the instrument, it decays, right? That's just the nature of the instrument. But he wants to fight that so that you feel the G
crescendo into the next note.
Go to the next note.
Yeah.
And I hear it that way, even though it's not what's happening.
Exactly. So what is Beethoven doing? It's very interesting. So one of the key things that happens in Beethoven's music is that the music goes inside you subjectively. What he wants to do is to create a kind of music for your psychological state. There's an inner volitional force that he wants you to hear. The music is coming from you. That crescendo is from you. It doesn't really matter what happens at the piano. So this is really interesting. This is a very important development in aesthetics. And I want to show you this in the next sonata we're going to do, because here Beethoven again makes you hear yourself as music. So this is a very famous sonata, Opus 13, the Pathétique sonata, right? It's a sonata of great tragedy and pathos. It's a sonata in C minor. So the C minor is very important in Beethoven. Yes, all the Beethoven C minor pieces have this particular mood. And this sonata, of course, has that at the very beginning with this slow introduction. But the slow introduction is also very innovative because it's not just an introduction. What Beethoven does is to bring this introduction into the middle and into the end of the piece. And what we're going to do now is to play you the first time it comes at the beginning, then the middle, and the end. So it begins with a huge and then in the development section, it begins again with the same slow introduction. And finally, in the coda, he repeats exactly the same thing. So what Beethoven does is he takes away those big chords on those downbeats so that you hear yourself hearing the music, because the music is inside you. It's a psychological narrative that is inside your being. That's the subjective element in Beethoven that he's playing with all the time. So he's doing that, but when the fast music comes, when the allegro comes, you can actually feel this volitional will at work shaping the music.
That's right, and the dramatic contrast he creates in the sonata is also very typical of what he's interested in. At this point, it's important that we talk about his love of contrast, which you heard a little bit in the first sonata, last movement. Violent dynamic changes, and we can talk about his notation. So I'm given far more instructions, specifically as the musician, as the performing artist, than I would be from Mozart or Haydn, typically. There's lots of instructions tell me get louder here, get softer here. This note has to be accented, stop here. There's so much more will from the composer that's exerted. And it's not that when Mozart writes a piano or a forte for long sections, it's not like, well, that's all I'm supposed to do. I just have to do the piano and the forte. And of course not. Like, you have to play musically and do, but there was an understanding of the musician's understanding of style. And also, Beethoven imposes his imagination and will upon you. And that's another reason that's unmistakable when you're playing his music, that it's something else, something different. So just to use this famous is, of course, how he follows up that depressed opening. How does he write that? I'll play that one more time. So you can hear me doing these crescendos and then pulling away. And for the most part, I'm mostly playing softly, actually. But the energy feels like you've bottled something up. If I play different dynamics, if I play it all loud, for example, I'm like, well, it's an exciting piece. I have to make sure the audience isn't bored. I'm going to play everything loud. All right, it's exciting, you know. But there's a very, very deliberate choice made by the composer in how to deploy contrast to convey emotion and create drama and suspense.
Yeah, it's much better when violence is very quiet, right? It's a little bit like having a V8 engine in your Ferrari. Do you have a Ferrari? Anyway, this V8 engine in your Ferrari, you can go very, very, very smoothly at 20 kilometers or 20 miles an hour, and then you just put down that gas pedal, you put down that gas pedal, and it can go really, really fast, really loud, really fast. So it's that kind of energy that is in Beethoven. And it's like the Mannheim rocket, but now on steroids, right? You've got this kind of nuclear-fueled rocket that is sort of propelling you into space, as it were. And this is also what I mean by the sense of human agency that is in Beethoven. You really feel that you have absolute control of that power, because it can be really, really soft, but it's all there, and then you can go boom, and it arrives. So we're going to move on for another sonata, and this time we're going to talk something, a bit of a contrast, because we haven't really done Beethoven's humor yet. Right. Because he's actually a very funny guy. He's not that kind of serious, stormy Beethoven that we always imagine. Particularly in his early years, he was very affable, very friendly, very, very witty. And this is sort of represented in this particular sonata, Opus 14, number 2, his 10th sonata. And
right. So for a slow movement, or a middle movement, I should say, because it's an andante, he writes this theme, which is very tongue-in-cheek. There's a real joy out of writing music out of the simplest materials. Almost like, are you kidding me? Is this really what the piece is? Anyway, this piece goes on with this kind of good-natured fun, and the end is really where he pulls the rug out from under you, because you get this smooth variation that wraps up. Oh, okay, here comes the theme again. Stops.
So this is basically a trick that Haydn plays, but on steroids now. Do you know his Surprise Symphony? There's that kind of tick-tock kind of tune. So you're going tick-tock with this, and then suddenly Beethoven just blows the whole clock up in your face. And that's what I mean by the kind of slightly ironic humor that Beethoven is playing with. But of course, Beethoven is, you know, writing this kind of music, but he's going through a really difficult time in his life. From his very first sonata in 1795, he's really beginning to realize that there's something wrong with his hearing. And by about 1798, it becomes pretty serious for Beethoven. He's getting very, very worried about it. And by the turn of the century, you know, he's really in a suicidal, depressed state. And this is expressed in a particular document by Beethoven called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is a letter he wrote to his brothers, but he never sent it to them. And this testament was only discovered about a year after he died. But it actually says a lot of things that we kind of frame Beethoven with, because this is a time where Beethoven was really suffering, and his deafness was a very serious issue. So let me just read a few phrases from the Heiligenstadt Testament to you, so that you get a feel of what Beethoven is going through at this time. So remember, Beethoven is an affable guy. He's a witty guy, right? But his character is changing. And he writes this: "O you men, who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly you do wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. How could I possibly admit an infirmity, his deafness? How can I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection? What a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone heard a shepherd singing and again I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. And here's the important sentence. It was only my art that held me back. Oh, it seemed impossible to me to leave this world before I had produced all that I felt capable of producing. And so I prolonged this wretched existence. So what Beethoven is saying here is that he's sublimating his suffering into his art, and it actually changes how he composes.
It's also at this time that he, after finishing the Opus 22 Sonata, he writes, I'm very satisfied with this piece and I must seek out new paths. So there is this resonance in his personal life with also his composing where he needs to find a new way forward. And he has this mission of finding his potential. And so we have these revolutionary works that begin to be composed for us in our purposes in the sonatas, Opus 26, Opus 27 sonatas, which are quasi una fantasia.
Yes.
So they're no longer even really, they're linked experiences where the movements flow one into the next, very tightly composed, and we get the sound, this kind of sound suddenly.
Very famous music, right? You know this very well. But did you know it was revolutionary? Let me tell you why. So, quasi una fantasia, in the manner of a fantasy. So here's Beethoven. He is the master of form. He's outperforming Haydn, right, as the master of form. And now he's saying, there's form, and this is now going to be pitted against fantasy, right? The fantastic, imaginative element. This is now going to be Beethoven, the master of form, deconstructing form, or at least pushing it to the limits in some way. So when you hear this piece, you think, oh, this is such a nice Moonlight Sonata. But no sonata has ever begun like this. And instead of giving you form, he gives you something completely different. Now, if you analyze the first movement, everything is there. What we call sonata form is all there. But he doesn't present it to you. If it was Haydn, he'll say, oh, here's a theme, here's another theme, and all these contrasts helps define the form. But in this one piece, it's just one texture. Is one atmosphere. So form disappears into the background. And in fact, you can call it the ghost of a form, right? The ghost of a form. It's very, very blurry. And in fact, this is literally a ghost that is being represented in this music, because the music that inspires Beethoven is the accompaniment, the background, right, of a piece by Mozart. So in other words, instead of presenting the structural pillars of the form, he's giving you the wallpaper.
So this is music from Don Giovanni, and I love that you mentioned the word ghostly, because this is the scene where, in the beginning of the opera, the commendatore is murdered by Don Giovanni, and he dared to kind of challenge him, and the commendatore is expiring in front of Leporello and the Don, who are sort of looking down at this man, and you hear this music.
So if you wanted to dress up as a Beethoven sonata for Halloween, that's the sonata to wear, because actually it's a ghostly sonata. And if you do the pedaling as Beethoven suggested you do it, you will see that Beethoven is trying to conjure up some kind of blurry, floaty image.
Well, and that's the thing we talk about, the innovations. The innovations are not just in terms of form and ideas of material like that, but it's also just the sonority of what you're hearing. So if I do literally, this is famous, what Beethoven asked, which is just leave the pedal down. Sounds like this on a modern piano. This is where we get into a great argument for the audience. It's, oh, I love how that sounds. It's so interesting. Or did the pianist fall asleep? Did his foot just fall asleep?
A one-note theme.
Because all of these chords are mixing together, right? And it sounds very dissonant. Of course, the piano of the time sustained less, so it wouldn't have sounded. But still, there is a deliberate wanting of mixing of these sonorities. That's very key to this finding a new sound, achieving this ghostly effect.
Yes, and then as you heard, there's not really much of a melody there, right? It's just one note. It's a kind of death bell. Who writes that kind of a melody, right? So this is a really radical first movement. And of course, it caught the imagination of everyone. But there's also more that's radical about this sonata, because Beethoven basically says, guys, this is just one whole sonata. There are to be no gaps. So when you go from one movement to another, you just attack into the next movement.
And this is what begins us yelling at you when you clap between movements. This kind of piece. Because he actually writes it, you have to hold attention and attacca in one. So the whole piece becomes an integrated, deeply, directly emotional experience.
Yes, and it moves from slow to medium to really, really, really fast. So this is, again, a kind of Mannheim rocket, but this time the whole sonata is this particular rocket.
And it ends with a bang, right? In previous styles, often the last movement is kind of a graceful or a romp or something that's quick but flashy. In this case, the mass happens at the end of the sonata, which is something that the Romantics would really enjoy.
Yes, and also when Beethoven said he was about to go to this new path, it wasn't just a new aesthetic path, it was also a new technical path as well. Because when you get to this last movement, this prestissimo movement, he basically changes your piano technique. In the 18th century, when you're playing virtuosic stuff on the piano, you don't move your arms, you just use your hands and your fingers. That's your technique. If you try to do that with this particular movement, your hand would probably break. Because what Beethoven now wants is the new technique that Liszt and all those virtuoso pianists would take up in about 20 years' time, right? Which is to really move your arms like this in order to play, what we're used to now. This is the movement that does it. So again, you hear that actually a lot of it is soft at the beginning. That sort of power to suddenly explode is there. It's again this kind of Beethovenian chasing through the storm kind of idea. It's very, very dark, and you're going very, very, very fast.
And you have this, these destructive accents that contrast with the material before. And I've played this piece on a period instrument, and you really get the sense that he's taking the instrument to the absolute limits. I mean, when you finish playing this piece, the instrument's often knocked out of tune. There can be problems with the dampers. There's a real sense of pushing the instrument beyond its capabilities.
So, but when you played it, it was no longer in C sharp minor. At the end, it was already. It got down to C minor.
Notes, yeah. Well, and you sense. I think this is where people. Well, what would Beethoven have thought about a modern piano? I think he would have enjoyed it. What it can do with this kind of music.
So with this piece, you've got this quintessential Beethoven, this huge, dynamic, prestissimo, violent storm scene Beethoven. Now something of a contrast, because Beethoven's style can be described in two different ways. And the philosopher Theodor Adorno says, well, there's the intense Beethoven, right? The intensive Beethoven, which you just heard in that kind of movement, where things are very tight, very precise, and it seems like there's a kind of volitional force that's just driving the whole thing and holding everything together. But there's another type of Beethoven, he says, that's called the extensive type, where things seem to expand. And we heard that a little bit, actually, with the Grand Sonata, number 4, right? So we're going to play you a sonata now that does this kind of expansion. Because this kind of expansion is less of a sort of subjective element within you as something that is more objective. You're looking at, as it were, this landscape, looking at nature around you, and you're just a creature in nature rather than an agent sort of driving history along. So this now is the Pastoral Sonata, number 15, opus 28.
And this is another example of a nickname that was not given by Beethoven, but was given by a publisher as a marketing decision, a very, very intelligent marketing decision. So why was it called Pastoral? Well, it begins with a pedal point, and then we hear the melody over it. So I never once stopped playing Ds. The whole time I was playing that whole section for you, and that idea of a pedal point is essential to what's considered the pastoral style, creates a sense of eternity and endlessness. There's also such a sense of calm and peace about it. Small ideas are then picked up and repeated, but not to build conflict. There's an absence of conflict. And there's a love of nature that suffuses everything. And each movement in the sonata has that. If I skip to the last movement, we get again this pedal point, but this time lilting. Things get rowdy, but they're very happy, and there's a sense of popular music, too, being there. So again, absence of conflict, his ability to write in this kind of style, even while he's going through those enormous personal challenges and difficulties, which it's not so easy to read that in the darkness of the moonlight, but each sonata is its own universe of creativity. So he's able to just put everything aside and just work on each sonata.
If you think about it, right, in the Heiligenstadt Testament, he talks about hearing, not being able to hear the shepherd, that kind of thing. So actually the nature and the pastoral is really important for him to hear, and he begins to put it in his music much more in this way. Of course, the Pastoral Symphony, indeed. And I think the two things to keep in mind here about the intensive and the extensive style, right? The intensive style really is about history accelerating. We've just had the French Revolution, so things are really moving very, very fast in Europe at this time, and there's this sense in which things are really, really happening and accelerating. Time is accelerating. So you've got that kind of music, but at the same time you have this love of nature, love of the natural landscape, and so these two aspects are really in conflict, and Beethoven represents both, often not together, but there they are, side by side, like the Fifth Symphony and the Pastoral Symphony, and in this case, the earlier sonatas and this particular Pastoral Sonata. Now we've come to the end of the work we're going to do on the early period. We're going to move to the middle period now. But what I want to say about the early period is this. Often people say that this is a time of Beethoven's apprenticeship. He's sort of learning from Haydn. But obviously he's not. From the very, very first sonata, he really has it in the bag. And everything is here. The ironic wit, the mastery of form, the motivic technique, all that kind of energy, the dark, stormy stuff, the big pastoral stuff is all there already. So what happens now? The middle period is often called the heroic period. And we call it the heroic period because of the Eroica Symphony, the great work that sort of marks this big, big change in Beethoven's output. So for the piano sonatas, things become more grand, more heroic. Actually, in terms of technique, things get more concentrated. But in terms of form, they become more epic. And there are actually less piano sonatas during this period. And we're just going to show you just two of them, two really famous ones for this section, which is the Waldstein Sonata in C major and the Appassionata in F minor.
Yeah, and I think that, it's interesting that it takes him longer to write them. It sort of costs him more to do it. There's more experimentation in sound. And I think when we think about, this is always an interesting question to ask ourselves, why is this music, why has it lasted? Why is it still so important and played? I think for many people, the gateway is the heroic period, Beethoven. These are the pieces that fill concert halls all over the world to this day. You mentioned the Fifth and Sixth Symphonies, the Fourth Piano Concerto, the Violin Concerto, the Triple Concerto, the Razumovsky Quartets, these two piano sonatas. This is what is a gateway drug to Beethoven for many people because it's such exciting music and there's such an apparent message of battle or struggle between light and dark and what can emerge from that. And it's very dramatic music too. It's like there's some kind of implied narrative. It's like you're watching some kind of, you're listening to and following some kind of theatrical construction, but there's no story except in the music, but it sounds narrative. So maybe I should play.
We should play the opening of the Waldstein, because this is the thing about the narrative. This is dramatic music, right? So if you asked a listener at that time, what did Beethoven compose here? They said, well, that's not music. I mean, where's the theme? Where's the melody? I mean, that's just an accompaniment, right? Yeah? And then, where's my theme? That's my theme? That's just a little twinkle, right? What is this, right? So what Beethoven is doing is that he's actually turned the whole idea of music into gesture. You have this gesture here, that gesture there. So these are what we might call acts. It feels as if the music is actually just being an agent doing something. And so when we talk about Beethoven as a revolutionary composer, there is this sense of being a revolutionary, something that is about a kind of activist within the music. So when you hear this, it feels very, very much as if it's on some sort of dramatic stage.
Second theme. I should stop.
You can't stop, right? That's the whole point. You can't stop. Because what Beethoven does is this. He has all these disparate gestures. but he has this huge underlying harmonic structure that drives towards these cadences. So every time you arrive somewhere, it feels as if you've arrived on something really, really significant. It's the overcoming of struggle in order to arrive at that moment of victory. So when it gets to that second theme, for example, it feels as though he's arrived at this thing, and you can't stop because it has to go all the way to the end of the exposition, but we made him stop anyway. So this is the way you listen to Beethoven, right? At this point, he's just pulling you along with the most disparate stuff. It's absolutely amazing. And that's what I mean about this kind of volitional will that's just holding everything together. Now, the really interesting thing is when he gets to that theme, when he finally finds a theme, right, he's actually in a very bizarre key. We started in C major, and now he's ended up in this key, which is E major. And this has not been done before in the history of sonata form. So what Beethoven is doing is to move from the home key to a very distant key. So he's actually now stretching the form. And once you do that, it makes formal writing much more complicated to resolve, which is why the movements become much more virtuosic formally and also much longer and more epic. And it's also why he has to create these huge trajectories in the music.
Easy way to think about it maybe is the farther you wander from home, the longer it will take you to reach your home.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
And the greater the heroic quest,
right.
the heroic journey is going to be. And by the time we get to the end of this sonata, we get to a moment of glory.
Yeah, and this is another example of exploration of sonority. Again, I'm going to do the pedal that he recommends or instructs.
It's an extraordinary piece because actually Beethoven is not using very complicated material. The theme itself is just, well, just a triad really. It's very simple arpeggio, and it doesn't even change. He just plays it the same every single time. But what it changes is just the texture. So Beethoven is basically making texture the theme for this music, which is extraordinary. So you hear all these kind of sonorities, and these are new sonorities. You know, we've not heard this on the piano before. But if you think about it, these sonorities are made up of the most basic stuff. Scales, arpeggios, and trills. And this is the magic of Beethoven. He's going to develop this all the way to his very, very late style. He'll make the most banal, cliched, conventional things like piano exercises, into the most sublime, transcendental music. I don't know how he does that, actually.
It's amazing. I mean, really, this sounds like an exercise. If I play it a certain way, it sounds like what I should have been practicing when I was 8 years old, you know? And it's elevated. This happens also in something like this, you know, where he's basically improvising.
Yeah, and you should play them the end because there's this amazing octave glissandi. I mean, I don't know music.
We talk about innovation.
This is so bizarre.
You know,
you can't see this if you're sitting that side.
The end is a giddy, happy version of the material. But then, you know, he explores different colors and keys. Suddenly he writes for you to do this.
This is like this.
So I'm playing glissandi with my hands, but softly and with pedal. So there's a shimmer. I mean, extraordinary. And you get stuff like a trill in one part of the hand while the melody appears in the next. So incredible stuff in terms of pianism and texture.
So the whole movement begins to be just about sonority and texture. In fact, it sounds like a cadenza. The whole thing is a cadenza. So this is the improvisatory, kind of decorative elements of Beethoven that becomes very structural for him. We'll talk more about that later because he develops that very much in his late style. But now, something completely different, the Appassionata. Right? This is the F minor sonata. So 10 years earlier, in 1795, he wrote his first sonata in F minor, and now he writes this one also in F minor, and this is how far he's gone.
So this is number 1. We were there about an hour ago.
Yes. And now he's going to do the same thing, arpeggios, trills, but it sounds like this. You see, he can't stop either. It's exactly the same thing. So these huge long trajectories, huge contrast, lots of improvisatory things, lots of conventional gestures, scales, trills, arpeggios, but now in this very dramatic storm kind of scenery. And of course, we hear in this the Fate motive, the Beethoven 5 motive.
We do, and it's still amazing to me just playing that contrast, you know, from this same material in a sense, but the sense of ominous threat, and then you hear the turn. I'll fast forward a little. We hear another, then we hear a new thing. Forget about it. Happened again. And then we have this outburst, and this will become, and then all this, it becomes a total obsession in the movement, the idea of these triplets that begin with that thing you heard off in the corner or something in the opening. So that's the Fate motive.
From the Fifth Symphony, right, so it becomes this ominous threat. And this ominous threat becomes the quintessential storm scene in Beethoven in the last movement, where we really have this kind of person riding through the storm as if being chased. Maybe one way to understand this is to think, I mentioned it briefly already about the French Revolution. So with the French Revolution, things that seemed to have been very, very stable for a long time suddenly collapsed. And this had repercussions all over Europe. So you had the French Revolution, you have the Terror, then you have Napoleon, running right across Europe. So if you were living at that time, you just felt that history was accelerating. And I think it was Friedrich Schlegel that said what characterizes our time is just a sense of acceleration. So in this kind of music, it feels as if you're trying to outrun history. History is this dark, stormy thing. It's chasing you, and you're just trying to, ride out the storm. So there's this huge chase. And later in the 19th century, people understood this music not as the French Revolution, but as the Industrial Revolution, because they heard trains, mechanized sort of speeding machines in Beethoven. So it was always regarded as very, very modern industrial music. So this movement, the last movement of the Appassionata, is this kind of music. You will hear this kind of mechanized, manic, rotational kind of speed.
Right, and there is this harnessing the instrument, the percussiveness of the piano, which is something that was exploited in this music that would inspire people later, but that does seem prophetic of technology that had not been invented. I mean, when you hear that sound and its unstoppable nature.
You hear a train, right?
Yeah, that's right. And there is a tradition of moto perpetuo in classical music well before Beethoven, of a piece in which the motion is constant and continues, but the darkness and then what he does, Daniel mentioned acceleration to end the piece, right? Is an outrageous acceleration. You have
So we're going to move towards the last period, the late period, with a kind of transitional work of 1810. So Napoleon has been wreaking havoc across Europe, and he's invaded Vienna. So Napoleon's in Vienna, and Beethoven's patron and good friend and also pupil, Archduke Rudolph, has to leave Vienna, and Beethoven's very sad. So he writes this sonata called Les Adieux, farewell, for his good friend and his pupil. And this is one of his favorite sonatas at that time. And it's an extraordinary piece, because here we have Beethoven that's no longer this sort of revolutionary, heroic type, but he's doing something that is more, I don't know how to put it, more poetic, more moderate. And it goes something like this. It takes the simplest thing, a horn call. Can you play the horn call? Right, that's a horn call. So, when you're traveling, your horn calls, and you're sort of in your carriage, and you hear these sort of sounds of people traveling across the mountains and so on. But he turns the horn call into something that becomes more and more significant and more metaphysical. So this is what Beethoven does.
There's a famous choice he makes in the opening, because I played this without bass. I played. So you hear it that way, and implied is that we're in E flat major, but Beethoven writes So this is a slow introduction to an allegro.
And then, of course, he repeats the horn call again in the slow introduction, but this time he really warps the harmonies. And this is really taking that sense of horn call into the most distant place he can go, because, of course, Archduke Rudolph is going very, very far away, and he's very sad.
So you hear these three notes, which we heard. And this time you hear the same three notes, but harmonized.
Sort of magic moment, right, that you hear. And of course, so there we have that great opening of this sonata where Beethoven is transforming the most conventional, simple topic into something very deep and very meaningful, and in many ways very existential. There are also words, right, that he writes underneath the horn
and
call.
this is new. We actually have le be vol printed over those
farewell
three,
in German.
Yeah, over those three words. It's another nickname thing that happened too, because why did the publisher choose to write the nickname in French, les adieux, instead of using Beethoven's German, and especially given Napoleon's role in the story, it's very, very hard to understand. But this idea of having text and a motive that runs through the music, so then you hear these three notes through the sonata, le bévol as a motive. This is the kind of thing that would get composers like Schubert or even Alban Berg very excited.
Yeah, so he's, it's very, he's just saying farewell all the time, and it's quite. The word we use is programmatic, although that word didn't really exist at the time when Beethoven was doing it. In other words, there is an element where he is describing something. So when you get to the end of this movement into the coda, you will hear these horn calls again, but what you're hearing is actually the distant movement of the Archduke and his entourage in his carriages going off into the distance, and you hear these distant horn calls echoing across the mountains, and these echoes begin to clash with one another, and then you hear the trotting horses disappearing into the distance.
We have just the horn call.
Clashing horn calls. Trotting horses.
Now, Beethoven asked me to get louder here.
It's one of these crescendos.
On that note, for the end.
Yeah, it's one of those crazy crescendos that you can't play. So that's the farewell, the Le Bévol, the Les Adieux sonata. And with that, we say kind of farewell also to the middle period. And we come to a period now in Beethoven's life from about 1812, where he's not very productive, actually. He's not writing very great music at this time. And he's kind of a dry period for him. And then it really doesn't really pick up.
Family troubles.
Yeah, many troubles.
Everybody has to make a living kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the state kept asking him to write all this kind of very jingoistic music. Yeah. So it was not the best time. Yeah. But then he begins to rethink a lot of things. And the next sonata is the beginning of what we would call the late period in these sonatas, the last 5 piano sonatas. That's Opus 101 in A major, sonata number 28. This is written in 1816. And it exemplifies 2 things about the late style that you need to know. The first is this. Beethoven discovers a new kind of lyricism in the late style. The lyricism here becomes more intense. It's a kind of inner feeling. Actually, the description of this particular piece is in sort of an
innermost feeling.
Innermost feeling.
Deep innermost feeling, yeah.
So it's an inner sensibility. And it also has this feel that it's Beethoven talking somehow because of this inner feeling. So it has a kind of confessional element to the music. Whether it's really Beethoven talking, we don't know. But it feels that way. It feels confessional.
Yeah, and if we think back to the slow movements we heard today, this kind of these very spiritual or slower operatic And here we get to this deeply personal writing. This is the beginning of Opus 101.
So beautiful. So remember that in the middle period, it was hard to find a melody in a lot of the music, but now Beethoven discovers a new lyricism. So that's the first thing. We should also talk a little bit about the second movement because
we should.
Yeah, because another thing about the late style is
I want to say one more thing about that movement.
Okay.
Yeah, just before we move on. It's just because we have so many lovers of chamber music here, you could write this for quartet. Throughout so many of these late pieces, there are large passages that are a form of kind of string quartet writing, and that also contributes to the intimacy and sense of shared ideas across equals. The lines are contrapuntal. So in other words, sure, the first violin, but the second violin has a lot to say. The cellist, you're in this kind of perfect chamber music world, even though you're hearing piano music.
Yeah, actually, in the Opus 110, the beginning of that sonata, the expression mark is very odd because it's kind of with amiability. It's a kind of with friendship. It's a weird expression mark. So this kind of lyricism, it's almost something where he wants people to interact with him. Isn't it? That string quartet is the idea of people interacting, having an intelligent discussion together. And I think that's what Beethoven wants, a beautiful, intelligent, but loving discussion. He's yearning for that kind of contact, I think. So that's one part of Beethoven's late style. Another, of course, is the continuance of this kind of objective, ironic feel. And you get this in the second movement.
That's right. And you also get an oddly prophetic moment, again, that we've had a few of today. This music. Now, this march has replaced the minuet. It has replaced, it's not even really, is it a scherzo, I suppose? Maybe, but it's a march, and it's not a funeral march, right? It's... And if I keep going into Schumann's fantasy, I'm in the same kind of world, right?
Yes, that's right. Same kind of world. So Schumann is obviously a master of irony. And so you're not quite sure how serious this movement is, but at the same time, you're not sure that it's that humorous either. So there's this very, very difficult line that Beethoven is drawing, very, very typical of the late style. And the other thing that is very typical of the late style is this new interest in counterpoint, particularly a very German interest in the genre of fugue. So fugue is a big thing for Beethoven. Now, do you know what fugues are? Maybe we should explain fugues a little bit.
Yeah,
just
so,
before.
We have counterpoint with multiple voices. So here's Bach's Art of the Fugue. You start out with a single line. Bring in the second voice. Bring in the third voice. Each one continues independently, but they work together. Now, this is hard to write well. So it was seen as kind of proving your bona fide credentials.
Yeah, they're very intellectual, very difficult to write. And the art of fugue, of course, sort of explores all these different techniques where he sort of, Bach turns the theme upside down or back to front, or he makes it much longer and shorter. And he puts all these voices together, very complex, very mathematical stuff. And Beethoven actually is looking also into Bach's art of fugue as he's thinking about writing these sonatas. So in the late style, these late sonatas, there are many, many fugues, but they're very different. There are three types of fugues. And the first type is found in Opus 101, and that's what I would call the normal type of fugue that you might get in a classical piece. So Haydn, for example, writes sort of fugal passages in finales of some string quartets. And this type of fugue is something that is, I mean, it's Beethovenian, but it's not outrageous.
Right. It had...
So that's very conventional in many ways. Now the second type of fugue is what I call the anti-social fugue. This is something that is very late Beethovenian, and it's something that you hear in the Hammerklavier. This is a fugue that doesn't do what you think it's going to do, because fugues are supposed to bring things together in harmony. And Beethoven is studying Bach's art of fugue, and that's a fugue that tries to describe the whole harmonious cosmos working together. And what Beethoven does is to take the hammer of the Hammerklavier and bang this cosmos out of shape. So you get this extraordinary misshapen kind of fugue with all these distances and tonal harmonies being torn in all kinds of strange directions. So it's very anti-social and very weird. And in fact, he calls this fugue a very free fugue, but he's using all the techniques that Bach uses in the art of fugue to create something, well, out of this world, but a little bit nutty.
Right, and there's the fanatical energy from the subject.
Can you hear that kind of misshapen, antisocial feel to the fugue? But Beethoven is actually trying to invent a new type of logic. That's what he's trying to do. It's extraordinary work. And he'll do more of these fugues, particularly the Grosse Fuge in the string quartets, and also, actually, in the Missa Solemnis, it's also one of these crazy fugues. And then there's the third type of fugue, which is, I would call the sacred fugue, the fugues that are transcendent. So if you think of the kind of fugue that you might get at the end of Bach's B minor Mass, where the music is sort of being lifted up to heaven, and you get this very harmonious, celestial kind of sounds, Beethoven also does this. And you find this particularly in Opus 110, the A-flat major sonata. And this particular sonata, Opus 110, is, I would say, a very spiritual sonata. So it's actually very relevant that it's a kind of sacred fugue, because the sonata is all about some kind of a breakdown and a kind of resurrection back to life. And that's the fugue that brings life back into the whole sonata.
In fact, it has actually a healing role in that piece, because it's preceded by a movement in which there's almost an asthmatic breakdown of a melody.
Yes, literally there's a breathing problems in the music. Asthmatic is the right word.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The whole, it's literally a melody that you can't sing on the right beat. There's so many gaps in it, you can't breathe properly because you cannot breathe, you're too sad. Yeah. And then this healing fugue, this sacred fugue comes. And talking about sacred music, actually the Hammerklavier is a kind of sacred music. What Beethoven is trying to do here in this fugue is trying to infuse this extraordinary sort of gigantic heroic work with a kind of spiritual religious aura that doesn't quite match, and so you get this extraordinary clash of worlds in this fugue. And I'm not quite sure what it all means in the end, but this is an extraordinary work. And this is the breakthrough work, I think, in all the 32 piano sonatas. And this is the breakthrough work, I think, also in his late period. And what you have here is basically Beethoven with Thor's hammer, just doing that and breaking new ground. By the way, Hammerklavier just means piano in German. And in fact, the previous sonata, that very lyrical one, it was also the Hammerklavier sonata, as Beethoven describes it. But because this work is so dramatic, we always think of the Hammerklavier as a perfect description for this piece, because it really feels like Thor hammering away, and you get this very, very percussive sonata.
Right. I mean, I think the sonata sounds shocking, I think, to audiences. It has that ability to sound perpetually modern because it has so much energy, dissonance, density. I think what's interesting is, you started the talk by talking about Haydn's motivic development and the idea of taking a small idea and building up a work from that. Ironically, even though the Hammerklavier sounds so enormous and far-flung and sometimes like, what is he doing, puzzling, it's from that design principle, that aesthetic principle. Just reduced down to the smallest level, the piece begins like this. Then you take a break and absorb what just happened. There's a pause. This falling third, these chains of falling thirds, the piece is built out of them because Beethoven reserves the right to fall to different thirds. He could either go to that, he could go to that, he could go to that, he could go to that, and there are other options. So you form chains. So you just form chains of thirds going up or down, mostly down the keyboard. Second movement, falling thirds. In the third movement, we'll talk about that. The fugue subject, falling thirds. The counter subject has falling thirds. It's so, you have this giant, overwhelming composition that seems to be made. I mean, he said when he wrote it, now pianists will have something to work on for 50 years. Little did he know, right? And even he spent much more time on this sonata than any other work that we've talked about, almost a year and it's a sort of monument to many things, but also to just hard work.
Hard work into thirds.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, hard work on thirds.
I mean, even this opening after I play the fanfare, the polyphony. So there's dissonance in this piece because those ideas can clash. If this chord and that chord, if I put that together, that doesn't belong, right? So you get these really crunchy arrivals. That's what creates this particular sonority, which also seems to be recalling choral music.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, when you have these thirds, and the way Beethoven's dealing with it here, It's the same thing with the Waldstein sonata. These new harmonies, these new tonalities become the structure of the music, but it's so complex. All these harmonies are so distant from each other that, of course, this Hammerklavier sonata has to be the longest sonata, written by Beethoven and for a long time by anybody, actually. But maybe we can play the middle of the slow movement, where there's this music that comes only once, right in the middle of the slow movement, where Beethoven gives the game away, where he has this chain of thirds with all the harmonies that go with the thirds. And the thing about thirds are they don't actually work very well. Chains of thirds don't work very well in the tonal system. So they actually create these very distant harmonies. And you can hear it here, but you will also probably recognize in this a piece by Brahms. These are all the chains of thirds. So those are those changes of thirds. Does anybody recognize Brahms' Fourth Symphony in that? Maybe. Anyway, so that Brahms actually stole it from Beethoven. It's true. But there, with those chains of thirds, you also get these very huge cycle across very, very distant harmonies. So Beethoven is revealing the structural hand in that just one moment in the piece. But of course, it also affects the transition to the fugue itself.
There's this very famous page of, we finished the slow movement, and then you get an introduction to the fugue, in which there's this moment where it seems almost like you're invited in to the composer's mind about how to move forward. And this can be very metaphysical too, because of how deeply spiritual and huge the slow movement is. So how do you pick up from something like that? Well, you have options, right? So you begin with the note F. You hear it again. Then my bass falls 1/3 down. Okay, and fall another third down. Fall another third down. Take a break from the falling thirds and try to play something polyphonic. Maybe this is how we're going to move on with this next movement. No. Go back to the falling thirds. So my bass is falling a falling third again. Stop here. Try something else. This is like a scale exercise for piano. Let's go back to the falling thirds. Let's try this. No. Back to the falling thirds. Okay, maybe here. Fast forward a little bit, sorry. Now we hear falling thirds, staggered rhythm in my left hand. Not together. Falling third to F. Okay. Phew. We made it.
Yeah. It's one of the very strange transitions, you know.
Behind the scenes too, I started on an F, and I ended
you're going the cycle.
on an F. So we did all of that.
The whole cycle of thirds is there. It's amazing. And it's very Beethovenian for the late start, because a lot of pieces, Beethoven actually likes you to look into his brain, the compositional process. So there, he's saying, yeah, not this, not this, not this, but this, right? The same thing happens at the end of the Ninth Symphony, in the finale. He plays all the different movements, and then he says, not these tones, let's try something else, right? That's what's happening here. The grosse fugue is the same, where Beethoven says, you know, there's this idea and this idea, here's my table of contents, and off we go, right? So he's letting you in to his compositional thinking. That's what's going on there. But of course, this piece is so much more than all the thirds, right? Because it begins heroically, right? It's a real fanfare, again, for Archduke Rudolph. And then there's this very, very humorous, very short scherzo. And then you get probably the most profound and definitely the longest slow movement in the Beethoven Piano Sonata cycles. And this is an extraordinary movement. And this is where the spiritual element begins to really come in, because it's a movement that's very, very dark. And it's probably inspired by a dark Mozart, that kind of tragic Mozart, because there's an F sharp minor, and there are very few slow movements in F sharp minor. And the only other one is probably this one, from Mozart's A major piano concerto K488, I think. Yeah. And so Beethoven is probably picking up on that, but he makes it so much darker. So these are very thick, closed-in chords. And the commentator, Wilhelm von Lenz, calls this a mausoleum. We're inside a mausoleum. There's no light in this music at all. It's thick darkness and very, very heavy. So it feels like we're in a very, very dark, deathly place. And then Beethoven does one of his most amazing things, and he has this extraordinary moment where you think, actually, you've just entered into the Missa Solemnis, and this light comes in. And then it disappears again. It's one of the most amazing moments in all music, I think. But the strange thing is, Beethoven is not writing the Missa Solemnis yet. He's not even thinking about it. But somehow that little bit, which is actually in G major, is a quotation from the Benedictus of the Missa Solemnis. In other words, it has for him already a kind of religious connotation. And this whole movement is really about this very dark music and these glimpses of light that begin to take over. And one of the really interesting things about this movement, even though it's so long, how long is it? It's like 17 minutes.
Yeah, so it can be even more depending on tempo.
Yeah, really, really long.
Yeah.
So it's in F sharp minor, but he never gives you that perfect cadence into F sharp minor. That chord never comes. He cannot be that tragic. He will not let fate happen. And so he keeps it open. The light is there at the end of this movement. It's actually sort of radiant.
Right.
Should we play that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's the transition.
So it ends with this glimmer of light. And I think this is why Beethoven is at his wit's end about how do I follow this? How do you follow this kind of movement? Which is why he does this thing like, shall I have this fugue or this fugue or this fugue? What am I going to settle on? So he settles on his fugue, but the fugue itself is very, very strange. Not only because it's kind of a little bit, all over the place. It's haywire, kind of antisocial fugue. But also because almost towards the end, again, this religious, Missa Solemnis, choral sacred writing comes in, right? And there's this kind of clash again between the sacred and I suppose the human agent.
You hear this music.
Yes.
After the fugue sort of exhausts itself.
Yeah. This is sacred music.
Right. But it doesn't last.
No.
This is what Charles Rosen calls the most beautiful moment in music here. It's pretty subtle.
And then the fugue comes back and sort of smashes it all up again.
Right.
Yeah. And so the question at the end of this piece is, what does it all mean? Because we started out very heroically.
Right.
And we should end heroically. I mean, Beethoven knows how to do victorious endings. So I don't know what you make of the endings, Gilles.
Well, I think that you kind of got me thinking with this, we've already been to the depths of sacred spirituality. The fugue has something about industry to it and moving on with one's life with this prodigious work ethic, which I think another theme in this talk has been work ethic. I mean, there's been such a drive put on by the composer himself, on himself, like to make every piece a new creation, a new direction. There's just this unstoppable force, not only in so much of the music, but also in this person's spirit. And the fugue, I think, is just that energy. What do you do with that? It's not a sacred fugue, so you get this, the trills. That's all there is to say, right? It's just reducing it down just to the trills, and that's it.
That's it. It's not a victory.
No.
It's not a heroic victory. In fact, those last chords, I mean, you probably think it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like those heroic endings that Beethoven's very good at, but it's not the case if you look at the music.
Right.
In fact, it's on the beat 3.
They're on the beat 3, yeah.
So, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Yeah,
3.
Yeah. So what on earth does that mean, right? There's a question there that he's asking the pianist to think about. This is not the victory that you think it is. And I like this idea of industry of work because you have the idea of both the work and the religious stuff as a kind of grace that is sort of hovering there, right? And he's having this struggle between work and grace. Extraordinary piece. Now, we get to the last sonata, Opus 111 in C major. Well, essentially it's C minor, I should say. So it's basically one of his tragic works again, and now he finds a new way of resolving that dark tragedy. And it's a way that has never been done before. And basically he just transcends the planet into some ethereal realm. And the story that goes with this, it's not a true story, but the way the 19th century likes to think about it, is that Beethoven writes the sonata, so a stormy C minor first movement, and then he writes this arietta, this theme that is in C major. It's all light and very lyrical, and he writes this piece, and it ends in such a way that he cannot write a third movement. There's only 2 movements, because nothing, really nothing can follow this movement. It's so transcendent that not only can he not write a third movement, but he cannot write another sonata. This is the end of all sonatas, because it's transcended in this way. And so what happens in this set of variations at the end is that Beethoven does his late Beethoven thing, which is he just reduces everything to, well, conventional, cliched trills and arpeggios and scales, but he makes the most basic conventional thing, the most transcendent spiritual thing that you can possibly imagine. And many people think that he's basically left the planet and has entered into sort of eternity. Time kind of stops with these sort of textures of trills and scales and arpeggios, right? That's one way of hearing it, that this thing is completely disembodied and ethereal. The other way of hearing this is that Beethoven is completely deaf and he wants to hear his music. So if you can create a sound of immense resonance on the piano, just a C major triad resonating with scales and arpeggios and trills, maybe he can capture something. Because actually on his piano, he had this hood that was trying to get the sound into him, and also he would put his legs on the piano and he would feel it so that he'd get the resonance. So this is in one sense the most embodied resonance music that you can imagine, but at the same time it is also the most ethereal, disembodied music that you can imagine. It's probably both things, but it's such an amazing ending to the sonatas that we have to hear it. Thank you very much.